invitation to the number 586. You may be seated.
I want to correct something that was said, and I know Matt didn't think of it this way, and I don't believe any of us here think of it this way, but the appropriate time to obey the gospel is now. And you don't have to wait until I deliver the invitation at the end of my lesson. I don't want you to think that you could possibly be lost based upon a technicality. We are to obey God. We are to come to Him. And the idea of something that we would come up with, and I know Matt feels the same way I do about this, it's just, the way we say things sometimes. But don't think that you can't come, at any other time. And, it doesn't matter whether we're here or not. My phone number is in the bulletin. It is on the website. Call anytime. If you feel like you are ready to obey the gospel, please don't get hung up on technicalities and let that keep you from it. On the flip side of that, understand that we are definitely not going to be saved based upon technicalities. Now, what do I mean by that? A lot of times in our studies, we talk about speak where the Bible speaks, be silent where the Bible is silent. And that is absolutely true, and we need to do that. But if we're not careful, we will go the route of the Pharisees. And we will decide, okay, here's exactly what it says. And so, as long as we don't go across that line, we're okay. We're okay. It's technicalities. I think about in our justice system, and I'll just tell y'all even right now, I don't know a whole lot about the justice system. I grew up watching Perry Mason and Matlock, and so, things like that, that's where my knowledge comes from, observance of things going on. But I did come across this story, and I'm not going to read about the guy's name or where it was, doesn't matter. But I want to tell you about this man. He was accused of murder. There was a young lady who was stabbed to death in a park, that sort of thing, and they narrowed it down to this guy, and they arrested him. They put him in jail. But the prosecutor had a hard time getting the case together, and whatever the reasons were, and it doesn't matter what the reasons were, but it took 5 years for him to get that together. Well, guess what? We have laws in our country that you have the right to a speedy trial. Well, because of the delay of that, because of that technicality, the man was released, and he was never tried for that murder. Released on a technicality. We are not going to be claimed innocent based upon a technicality, and I'll show you why this morning. Turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. And this is just one instance in which we could apply this, but you could apply this in many other areas as well. The Pharisees, or the Jews, they felt like, in a sense, they got away with murder, in a sense. Now, not technically speaking, because technically speaking, they didn't murder. They didn't kill anybody. But what Jesus shows us here in Matthew chapter 5 is what you have done is, you go over to Matthew 15. I'm not going to go over and read it, but over in Matthew 15, he brings up the law, honor your father and mother. And he talks about how you have made that law of no effect because of your traditions. Well, they've done the same thing with this one that we're getting ready to look at. In the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, and it's repeated over in Deuteronomy, the Israelites were commanded, do not kill. That's the way it is in the King James Version, and most of your modern versions it's going to say murder because that's really what it's talking about. Do not murder. Don't commit murder. Well, what the Jews had done is, and we'll see this as we go through, is they had changed it. They had softened that law to where it did not have the same brunt. They were if someone was accused of murder, if somebody killed somebody in that way, they were to be put to death under the law of Moses, stoned to death. That was the end. That was it. There's not a whole lot said about a trial, okay? They were put to death. But the Pharisees and the teachers, the rabbis, they had changed these things as we go through. And what I want to do is I want to look at what Jesus says about this, and I want to think about, okay, what does this have to do with us, and how does it help us in our Christian walk? So here in Matthew chapter 5, start with me in verse 21. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of judgment, and whoever says to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Agree with your adversary quickly while you are on the way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge and the judge hand you over to the officer and you be thrown into prison. Assuredly, I say to you, you will by no means get out of there till you have paid the last penny. First thing I want us to notice this morning that Jesus teaches us is anger is the same thing as murder. I mean, he just up and tells you that right here. Anger is the same thing as murder. Jesus teaches that anger is equated in such a way that, and we may not, as we read through this, we may not see this right off. But I want you to think about what Jesus does. He doesn't beat around the bush when he's talking about these things. He's bringing it out in such a way that they understand exactly what he means. And so as we read down through here these different situations that he's talking about in verse 22, he's bringing up those situations because that's what they're doing. They were changing the law of murder. You see, they reduced the command to what gets you in trouble with the law. You listening to me? They reduced the command to what gets you in trouble with the law. That's what that's talking about in verse 21, where it says you're in danger of judgment. Some of yours will say in danger of the courts or liable to the courts, things like that. But it's the idea that you're going to be brought before the courts. You're going to get in trouble if you commit murder, if you actually do that very thing. But then as we see, as he goes on down through there, he talks about this idea of raca. It is believed that that word means empty head or good for nothing. That's what that means. And so if you talk to somebody like they ain't got no sense or anything like that, that's what Jesus is talking about here. I know none of y'all are guilty of that, so we'll go on to the next one. Jesus also says there at the end of verse 22, he says, but whoever says, you fool. Whenever you go back and you look at that Greek word, that word that is translated fool is where we get moron from. And the way they used the word, and there was a tone of a voice behind it too, and the way they used the word was it had to do with someone who was morally corrupt. And I think I actually put this on the slide, and here I am, I get caught up, and here we go. All right. So the fool is one who is morally worthless. And so what Jesus is showing is, yes, you know what? If you commit murder, absolutely. You're going to pay for that. But then he says, you know what? If you call somebody an empty head, a good for nothing, you're worthless. You ain't, you're not any good for anything. Stupid, dummy, things like that. Well, Jesus says you're going to get in trouble for that too. And then he goes on to say, he says, what he's talking about with you fool is he's talking about let me tell you what the Jews would do. As I was reading through this and studying about this, I just got irritated more and more at the Jews. Not all the Jews. I'm sure they wasn't all this way. But what were they doing? They took the law of Moses and they said, okay, as long as I don't kill him, I can do whatever I want. As long as I don't end his life. They would call people names. That fool, one who is morally worthless, they would ruin their reputations. Slander. That's what that's talking about. And Jesus says, you're in trouble for that. You are not going to stand. You see, anger is bad enough. Anger is bad enough to get you in trouble with God. The anger Jesus speaks of here, now understand there's different kinds of anger, okay? The anger that Jesus speaks of here is an anger that is seated in the emotions in such a way that it grows. It's not an outburst of anger. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about when you have something against somebody, whenever you're allowing that anger to fester within you. And it's that kind of anger that leads to this name-calling and ruining reputations. And if not unchecked, it will lead to murder. It'll lead to worse things. Therefore, they needed to learn to not be angry with the brethren, because that's where it starts. And so us as Christians, we need to understand that anger is dangerous. Anger is dangerous for the Christian. You know, John wrote in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 15, he said, whoever hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. You know, that's strong words. That is strong words. What is John saying? John is saying the same thing Jesus was saying at the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. If you harbor hate in your heart for someone, if you have, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 17, he prayed that we would all be one as he and the Father is one. And yet what do we see? I'm not talking about religious division. I'm talking about the Lord's church. What do we see in the church? We see animosity toward one another for something somebody said, for something that somebody did. Misunderstandings that are dividing us, that are keeping us apart. And that ought not to be. We should not allow those things to come into our lives. In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul said, let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. Over in the Colossian letter, which would be viewed as the parallel to this, he said, but now you yourselves are to put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. Did you notice the similarities? And did you notice the things that were coupled along with anger? It was things of the mouth. Blasphemy, filthy language, evil speaking. He says, don't do that. Where does it start? It starts with anger. Don't think bad. Don't think bad of somebody. If you find yourself thinking bad of somebody, stop it and think about something good. Think about how you can correct that. But stop thinking bad, because that just grows the anger, and it's going to lead to you talking bad about them. It's going to lead to you slandering against someone, ruining a reputation of someone, and I've seen it happen. I've seen brethren in the Lord's church talk about somebody else, and they didn't intend for it to ruin the reputation. They didn't intend for that. But because they were so upset about a situation, it just happens. And then they're forever changed. I love that song that we sang. Angry words. Oh, let them never from the tongue unbridled slip. Well, how do you do that? Well, you fix the anger before it ever gets to that point. And that's what Jesus is trying to teach about here. The wrath of man does not produce righteousness. James taught that in James chapter 1 in verse 20 when he said, "For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God." The word wrath there is the same word, the same root word for anger over in Matthew chapter 5. Don't allow your deep-seated anger for someone to cause problems between you and God, because it does not produce righteousness. Whoever has done good for someone when they have harbored anger in their heart toward that person? It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. Evil actions come from evil thoughts. And I'm going to say this. I know you've heard it because Barney Fife has said it. Nip it in the bud. But it is so true. That's what we've got to do. We've got to go to the source. We've got to go to the beginning of the problem, and we've got to deal with that. Do not let anger grow in your heart toward anyone. And then anger must be dealt with. Let's look back at our passage in verses 23 and 24. He says, "If you bring your gift to the altar and there remember your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother and then come offer your gift." Anger must be dealt with, and Jesus needed to teach them. Now, the setting in which he is describing here is worship. It has to do with worship. The Jews, they would come and they would offer their sacrifices. They would, give offerings of money, whatever it may be. They would come and make their offerings to the Lord. But Jesus is saying, you know what? Bringing that offering to God does not fix the situation between you and your brother. Making your offering to God does not fix the situation between you and your brother. The implication is here that your worship to God is hindered whenever you're harboring anger towards someone else. Anger hinders the worship of a Christian. When we think about, and there I put too much stuff up there and then I forget to push the button. Our worship is our offering. We don't come and offer sacrifices now. Now, we do give. On the first day of the week, we do that. That's an offering, okay? But what the Hebrews writer says is, "Therefore, by him let us continually offer the sacrifice of praise to God, that is, the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name." And so our coming together and worshiping and praising God, that is our offering to God. Part of it. It's not all of it. But that is part of our offering to God. And whenever we harbor anger in our hearts, then what Jesus is telling us is that maybe that's not getting there. It's hindering our worship. God's not hearing you. If you go back and you read through the prophets, you've got the major prophets and the minor prophets. That's the way we've labeled them, But you read through all of those, and you see how many times God says in those that I'm not hearing you, I'm not accepting your sacrifice because of all of the sin. Well, what is the sin he's talking about? Well, most of the time, it has to do with how they were treating each other. Yes, idolatry was in there too, but it had to do with, offending the poor or oppressing the poor and not taking care of them and things like that. How you treat one another. It hinders our worship. Our doing good and sharing with others is also part of an offering. In Hebrews 13, the very next verse, it says, "But do not forget to do good and to share, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased." And so those are things that we ought to be doing regularly. And yet God says, through Jesus, if you've got anger, those things are hindered. They are not accepted. Your anger with the one next to you in the pew can get in the way of your worship. And I'm not saying the one sitting right next to you, but I'm saying here in the congregation, your anger with your brother or sister is going to get in the way of your worship. Anger from offenses, and I understand we get offended, don't we? When people say things, and most of the time they don't mean it that way at all. I've done it. I have offended people by things I've said. I understand that. But you know what? I'm human, and my words don't always come out as plain as it ought to. Okay? And so we need to understand that. I think what the Jews' problem was the Jews forgot a very important point, and we don't need to forget this either. We don't need to forget that each and every person sitting here this morning is created in the image of God. You see, the Jews forgot that because they looked at the Gentiles as less. And we've seen that in our country with racism and different things like that. Looking down upon people because of, where they come from or who they are, things like that. But each and every person is made in the image of God. And so if there's a problem between us, it needs to be fixed. Go over to chapter 18 and beginning there, and he talks about the middle of that chapter, how you deal with a problem if someone offends you, or, if you're offending someone else. We take these two passages and put them together, and we see that it doesn't matter whether you're the offender or the offendee. If you know about it, go fix it. Go fix it. Because those things stand between you and God. Differences of opinion, and I have seen congregations split over the color of the carpet. And that is all kinds of wrong. That is all kinds of wrong. There are going to be differences in opinion. You know what? And some of y'all have told me some of your opinions that are different from my opinions. And you know what? And that's fine. You can have your opinions as long as it's not going against the Word of God. I don't have a problem with you having a different opinion than I do. But we can still worship God, can't we? We don't have to have that anger within us. As I said earlier, most of the time it's just a misunderstanding. Go to the person. Take care of it. Find out if that's really what they mean. And if that's what they meant, then let's talk about it. Because, we need to address these problems. But deal with it. Deal with your problems with your brother, and then come to God and worship Him. Anger must be dealt with quickly. As we go through that passage there in verses 25 and 26, notice what he says, agree with your adversary quickly. Now what he's doing is he's bringing an earthly example into this and using an earthly example. And you think about, and again, Perry Mason, that's my standard, that's where I go to. But what do you do whenever you have a legal problem? Well, you want to try and fix that legal problem. And I know some of y'all that are in that realm. If you can do it without going to courts, isn't it a whole lot cheaper? You deal with that problem before you get to that point. That's not what Jesus is talking about. That's not what he's talking about. You see, in the Roman society, this idea in verse 26, assuredly I say to you, you will by no means get out of there till you have paid the last penny. What Jesus is saying is, once you've let it go to that point, you have gone too far and it can't be fixed. Because if you're in prison, you can't earn no money to pay the last penny. You're there. That's it. That's the end of the road. The Jews understood that. And so what Jesus is saying is you need to deal with it quickly before it escalates to a point that it cannot be fixed. And there is that point. There is that point that it cannot be fixed. Contentions between brethren must be dealt with before they can't be dealt with. Paul taught that it needed to be done quickly. In Ephesians chapter 4, verses 26 and 27, he said, be angry. Notice there's the word. You can be angry, but don't sin. He said, do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil. In other words, you need to deal with the anger. Listen, anger is an emotion. It is an emotion that wells up inside of us based upon stimuli that comes from outside of us. Sometimes. Sometimes it's our own thoughts makes us mad. But you understand what I'm saying? It is events outside of us that causes us to have this emotion. When we find that we have this emotion, then we need to go deal with that. We need to deal with whatever it is that causes that emotion. You think about those of you who are in the medical field, certain wounds left untended will not ever heal. Or at least they won't heal back properly. You've got to attend to those things. I think about those who have, we went through COVID, and that's such a horrible thing that I say went through because now they don't even care anymore. They don't tell you to test for it or anything. Oh, we'll test for it if you want us to, It's that sort of thing. That's the way they deal with it now. But for a while, it's like if you don't do something about this, you're going to die. Cancer, different things like that. If you don't deal with it, it gets worse and worse. There is a point, I think about those who suffer with diabetes, and I mean on the most severe level where they'll get infections, in their arms or in their feet or legs or things like that. And if you don't deal with that infection very quickly, it escalates very quickly, and I have known people who have lost limbs because they didn't go get it taken care of quickly. There is a point of no return. And that's the way it is with our anger. There's a point of no return, and Jesus is saying you need to go deal with that as quickly as possible before it gets so far gone that you can't deal with that anymore. So take care of it quickly so that no one is lost, and I mean lost. Technicalities. Sometimes we get hung up on those things. The Jews did. They got hung up on technicalities. They didn't understand the spirit of the law. And that terminology, you think about our court systems today and the Supreme Court, and people get into arguments and all this stuff. They don't know the spirit of the law. They're not going by the spirit of the law. Well, they didn't understand the spirit of the law. And Jesus helps them to understand that here in the Sermon on the Mount. There's no getting off on a technicality with God. You can't do it. Think about technicalities when we think about that, salvation. No one is ever going to get saved accidentally or based upon a technicality. Technically speaking, we are all doomed to hell. Every single person on the face of this planet, technically speaking, is doomed to hell. So if you want to talk about technicalities, there's the technicality. But because of God's love for us, because He doesn't like to be angry with us, He's angry at the sin, then He did something to resolve that situation. We need to learn to resolve our anger issues. Don't allow anger to grow towards someone, because Jesus is saying that's just as bad as murdering them. Just as bad. What you have in your heart, whether it is love or anger, is a big deal to God. And so we need to get our hearts right. We need to take care of these things. Has to do with peace, doesn't it? We want peace in the Lord's church so we can spread the gospel. We want peace so that we can help others see that peace and the joy that is being a Christian. We can't have that peace if we don't have peace with God. And so you need to fix your relationship with God so you can have that peace. This morning, if you are not a Christian, I would beg you, please, at least consider studying it. Let's talk about it. Let's sit down and talk about it. If you are ready to obey the gospel this morning, we are ready. I've been ready all morning. I've been ready. But if you're ready, we can help you with that. If you understand that Jesus Christ died for you, that He is the Son of God, understand that you need to repent of your sins. That is to change your mind about sin. You're not going to live that way, and you're going to fix the things that you need to fix. Confess Him as the Lord of your life, as the Son of God. And then be buried with Him in baptism. You're buried in water, but it symbolizes what happened to Jesus. He was buried in the tomb. And just as He was buried, Romans chapter 6, you come in contact with His blood, then you rise up from that grave to walk a new life. You're not going to get a new life, a life with peace in God, unless you go through that, because that's what Jesus commanded. If you're ready to do that this morning, we're ready to assist you in that. If you need to study more about it, we are ready to study with you. If you have done those things, but this morning there's something wrong between you or somebody else, if you need to take care of it privately, you take care of it privately. But if there is a public thing that needs to be taken care of, let's take care of it publicly. But take care of it. And let's work on it together as a family. If we can help you in any way this morning, please